Hello, everyone. It's 7 o'clock, and welcome to another History Time. Hope everyone's well. It was actually a nice day here today. The forecast is a bit dodgy for tomorrow, but I think the weekend will be okay. There's a mini storm coming our way now. Tomorrow. So, um, okay, I think people are still logging on. Hi, Dennis. Hope you're well. Batten down the hatches for tomorrow. We're going to get rained on, but for a change, it's going to rain much more on the East Coast and be windier on the East Coast, which is a bit strange, but I'm not objecting. I'm not objecting. The night before last was quite windy. Um, so I hope everyone is well. I'm actually going to start talking about that, about something different. Last night, hold up, it's not coming up well in the camera. Last night I was at an interesting meeting. It was the launch of this report, Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment Report about Skellig Michael, um, which brought up some very interesting issues, things I hadn't thought about before. Um, because Skellig Michael is an amazing place, but it's a fragile one. It's way out. I think it's 12 kilometers, so I think 8 or 9 miles out in the Atlantic. And it will face many difficulties due to climate change, such as increased rainfall, which could damage the built structures there because water will build up in certain places and is already building up. Other things could be dieback of the grass, etc., in certain areas, which will lead to increased erosion, etc. So they're trying to come up with a plan to deal with various possibilities, and I hope they do come up with a plan because if you've never been there, I would really, really recommend that you go there sometime. It's difficult to get to, and due to the weather, the boat trips can be cancelled and are cancelled a lot, but it is really, really worth it. It's out of this world. Um, so if you ever get the chance, go for it, and hopefully it will be. Um, they will be able to look after it properly, because there are kind of rock falls every year. And something interesting I discovered yesterday is that the tourists, when they visit it during the season, I think they're all gone home by 2 or 3, and then there are people from the OPW essentially walk up and down the steps, all the steps. They look through the island each day to check on the steps, etc., because the steps are carved out of rock, and also many of the puffins nest under the steps. So it's a very fragile environment, one they have to take care of. And when the OPW and the Parks and Wildlife and archaeologists, the Monument Service, talk about what they do there, I found it very interesting to discover their work. And like sort of the season is basically May to the end of September, maybe the beginning of October, but they need kind of several weeks beforehand to prepare the place because they have to go there every year and find out what damage the winter has done. And and they're starting to do surveys like underwater lidar surveys around it, etc. So there's lots of fascinating things around it. Hi, Kat. Hope you're well. um so it was interesting. It'll be something that's going to come up, how climate change is going to affect historical sites. um and another thing is, if the sea levels rise, it'll play havoc. I'll be lucky because I'm up high, but and actually the Skelligs is quite high as well. But like a small rise in the sea level could um, mess up with the landing of the boats, because the if you've ever gone to the Skelligs, you'll notice the landing is a bit peculiar. You There is a pier, and you essentially jump off the boat onto the pier at a certain time. The guy from the boat will yell at you, and then they yelled at me. They said I did it all wrong, but it was worth it. It was worth it. Um, so I don't know if you watched the podcast I did yesterday with Mihal and Philip, or last week. Last week we were discussing identity. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that now. Start talking about identity, because it's something. Identity is something that changes all the time. Like here in South Kerry, there is a problem with depopulation, especially young people, because generally people, they finish school, some will do apprentices, some will get jobs, but a huge amount will go away to university to work in Dublin and Cork, or like London, Australia. So the football clubs, the sports clubs, suffer quite a bit. But it's a funny illustration of the power of local identity, because different clubs are all joining up. For example, I live in Valencia, and there's a football club in Valencia, the Young Islanders. Then there's Skellig Rangers in Port McGee, and they will never join up. The Valencia will always join with a bit more distant clubs. So there's essentially, because of this very, very strong, very local identities. And then, like Dennis is he's listening now. He's from Cork, and like Cork and Kerry, like Cork City from me, I think it's about 2.5 hours drive. But like you cross into Cork, and there's a difference. And like the county level identities in Ireland are very important. Um, and they've been important for quite a while, because most of the counties replace uh, some sort of lordships. Kerry is funny because they split the Desmond lordship, and they put part in Cork and part in Kerry. But until about 5 elections ago, there were two Kerry constituencies: were South Kerry and North Kerry. My mother's from South Kerry, from Glenbeigh, so I spent all my life coming down to South Kerry. I had never been to Tralee, the county town. I had never really been to North Kerry until I moved here, and I had to go to Tralee to when I bought a new car to to get it ready and to get some documents. Um, so there is this local identity in Ireland is very important, and it always has been. You can possibly date that back to the Tua of the early Christian period, to the lordships of the, say, the Gaelic period of the late Middle Ages. Hi, Kira, from the west. We're not so. We've been having sun today, and it was actually warm. So I drove around with my car window open for a while. But I know it's going to be wet here tomorrow. Um, so there's this local identity, but you also had a very strong cultural identity of Gaelic Irish, which goes back to Christianization. Well, we know it goes back to Christianization because we have written records. It probably predates that. There was a feeling of belonging to a shared political unit, a Gaelic political unit. At times, that political unit stretched into Scotland. Possibly it stretched into the Isle of Man, parts of Wales, and a few other places where Irish settlers were in the early Middle Ages, because a large amounts of Irish people, or groups of Irish, went into Wales, possibly, and some other places. Um, and they would have brought with them some sort of cultural identity. Um, at the same time, there was great rivalries, but like you could have rivalries within family. You did have rivalries within families. Provincial rivalries, possibly. Then at the same time, there would always have been, and there still are, other sorts of identities, like related to your work. If you were a priest, if you were a stonemason, if you were a farmer, if you were a soldier, you have certain types of identities. Um, then, like the Gaelic Irish proved very good at absorbing people. The North came in. Uh, they had some success, but they were held back. And if you look at the annals, etc., if you look at the history, the amount of victories of the Gaelic Irish over the Norse in battles is quite surprising. Clontarf was far from the only one. Essentially, like the as everyone knows, most of the Irish cities were founded by the Normans. Well, not by the Normans, by the Norse. The Norse moved into Ulster, but they got defeated in Ulster and got driven out. And some argue that this is the reason for the rise of Brian Boru. One of the secrets of his success was he had the Limerick Vikings, the Limerick Viking ships. They could go up and down the Shannon, and also the money that he could get money from them, coins, and therefore buy more soldiers, buy more weapons. Whereas the Northern Nail, by defeating the Vikings, they deprived themselves of that. Um, but so you have these dynamics related to identity. Um, in the from the Norman invasion onwards, you have a new group coming in who see themselves as English, as we've discussed on the other live stream quite a bit. They saw themselves as English, even though in many ways they absorbed much of the Irish culture, much of the Gaelic culture, but they had this very strong sense of being English. They knew how to speak Irish, they knew Gaelic customs, but they saw themselves as resisting the Gaelic Irish, as building an English kingdom in Ireland, protecting this English kingdom in Ireland, and shedding blood to protect this English kingdom in Ireland. So they could be seen as more Irish as the Irish than the Irish themselves, but at the same time they saw themselves as English as the English who were born in England. Um, with the rise of the Reformation, the advent of the Reformation, things start to get more complicated because previously Christianity was a huge part of the identity. The Normans, they brought in this new idea, an identity based on civilization. So the Normans who came into Ireland, especially the ones, say, who might believe what Geraldus Cambrensis was writing, they have this idea that they've come to Ireland on a civilizing mission. The Gaelic Irish were pagan, or pagan in all but name. They weren't really Christian, they were savages. Um, and that is an important part of their identity. But the Christian identity splits with Martin Luther and then splits again with the rise of Calvinism and various other things. So that is one of the reasons why the Reformation is so important. Previously, you had a Christian identity, which was essential in Europe. So no matter where you went in Europe, you knew that everyone was Christian. There were sects like the Hussites. There was a group in England whose name escapes me now. Um, but these were regarded kind of as deviant sects. If you have ever watched a film, it's an excellent film with Sean Connery from many, many years ago. It's based on Umberto Eco book, The Name of the Rose. Especially the book, it goes into great detail of the various sects, etc., that split away, that form. Um, but with Martin Luther, you have a big split in Christianity, one that survives. The Catholic Church persecutes it, but for various reasons, including economic and political, Lutheranism survives, and then the Reformation spreads. So suddenly you start seeing the development of a Catholic identity, a Lutheran identity, Calvinist identities, and then in English, a different sort of Protestant identity, which swings a bit towards Calvinism at certain times and back again, um, sort of more high church Anglicanism. But in the second half of the 16th century, the English identity starts becoming strongly based on being Protestant, even though, um, even though the a large amount of the English, especially in the north of England, they really only start to go fully Protestant in the 1590s. Um, in the late 16th century, you have a lot of English soldiers coming to Ireland who are Catholic and settlers. They come to Ireland because the anti-Catholic laws are less there. Um, they're less strong, so these guys can thrive. Like one would be the Moors, who they ended up occupying Mellifont Abbey. They survived the various problems in the 17th century. Um, and there's a photograph that people often show. It's a burnt out mansion in Mayo. Um, one of the Morphs ended up there. I think when the French landed in Killala, one of them was made the president of the province of Connacht. Um, I think he was executed, but his family survived. I think they still survive. But they had this big mansion somewhere in Mayo, and it got burned in 1922 or 23, and the forest has grown up around it. So it's several people take pictures of it from up high because you see this mansion in the middle of a forest. That was built by Moors who are they were New English who came in, but they were largely Catholic. Um, Several of the Bagnalls remained Catholic. The Hovedens, one of the Hovedens was many people think that Hugh O'Neill was raised in England. He wasn't. He was raised in the Pale by the Hoveden family. They were New English, but they were also Catholic. Um, so you have a fight over English identity in the 16th and 17th century. England had, everyone knows about the Pale in Ireland, but there was also a Pale in France, the Pale of Calais, which was all that was left of the English possessions in France. That fell when Mary was queen. But so until the 1550s, people who were born in Calais would have regarded themselves as English, even though they probably would have spoken English with some sort of French accent. And now I'm sure if you went to Calais, they would be shocked if you called them English. They, you know, might throw a beer at you or something. So with the Reformation, the English start having sort of an identity based on a Protestant-based identity. In Ireland, first of all, during the Second Desmond Rebellion, one of the Earl of Desmond's cousin, he gets very interested in this. He tries to have a Catholic uprising. It's not successful. And now Hugh O'Neill uses the idea. Hiram Morgan has written about it. He calls it the Fate and Fatherland idea. So they try and create this idea of a Catholic Irishness. In the 9 Years' War, it fails, but it emerges again in the 17th century. So, but in the Confederate and Cromwellian Wars, you still have a clear distinction between Old English and Gaelic Irish, and there's a lot of infighting. By the end of the 17th century, in the 1690s, you no longer have Gaelic Irish and Old English. You have Catholic Irish and Protestant Irish. And if you jump forward, say, to 1798, the 1790s United Irishmen, they try to create an idea of a new Irish identity, a Republican, based on a patriotic one, because anyone who's born in Ireland is Irish. Um, Initially, the Irishmen are non like they have Catholics, they have Protestants, mainly Presbyterians, um, but they fail, and then things get very complicated in the north of Ireland. The Presbyterians, especially, who many of whom had supported United Irishmen and had been in favor of some sort of independent, semi-independent Ireland, swing away from this idea. 1798 gets portrayed, especially in the 19th century, as a Catholic uprising, which it was to an extent in Wexford, but not always. And the Presbyterian republicanism gets forgotten. Like most of the founders of the United Irishmen were Protestant. Wolfe Tone, Napper Tandy, Monroe in the north, etc. So it was a middle class, lower middle class movement, which and that middle class was dominated by Protestants, both Anglican and dissenters. Um, and then, like the 19th century, you have a very strong rise of a Catholic Irishness. O'Connell contributes a lot to this. Um, and sort of it triumphs, say, in the 1920s with independence, etc. Things have swung away again from that, but um, I don't want to get into modern politics and modern identities. But just so identities change a lot and constantly. Garlic veteran, you're asking about the Hickey families from Limerick and Tipperary. Offhand I don't know about them, but I can come back to them next week. Um, they are Gaelic as far as I know, because like if you get any map of Irish history, and you see all these lordships, it'll probably name about 20 families. But if you dive deep into it, you'll find hundreds of names. Um, and like sort of where I am, it was South Kerry was all McCarthy Moore, but most the O'Sullivans held most of it. But then you dive down deeply, you have various branches of O'Sullivans who developed new names like McCrehan. Portmagee, which is the bit that sticks out behind Valentia, Ireland, was McCrehan's. They were O'Sullivans. McGillicuddy were O'Sullivans. But you have other ones such as O'Falvey, who were kings or lords in this area before the McCarthys moved in. You have lots of O'Driscolls. So you have lots of little groups. The Hickey ones I don't know enough about, but I will come back to that. I will come back to that. Yeah, there are like names change. Names change a lot. And I learned recently, I thought the surname of my daughter's maths teacher was Bat, but I discovered because he's a new teacher, like this year's the first year he's been taught. His surname is O'Sullivan, but everyone uses the name Bat, including in the school, because around here there's so many O'Sullivans. I even saw it. I was at a parent-teacher meeting last week, and so there must have been like 30, 40 teachers, and there was at least 5 or 6 O'Sullivans. So every O'Sullivan has a nickname. I think I've talked about this before. The journalist from CNN, Donny O'Sullivan, he's from Carsavine, and he started making a list of the O'Sullivan nicknames, and I think it reached 100. And so I talked about that. So there are lots of like O'Shea's. There's loads of O'Shea's down here, but I'll come back next week to that. Wayne, you ask good morning. I always find it strange, say good morning and looking out, and all I see is black. Are there Ogham stones in Dalriada, Scotland, like there are in Wales? Yeah, as far as I know, there are. Um, the majority of Ogham stones are in Munster, and then there is a big clunk in Wales. Probably, do you leave, Paul? Do you leave, Paul? Gonna start to. Um, there are a big group of them in Wales, probably brought over by a group from Waterford, the Desi, who settled in Wales. But there is Ogham stones and other Ogham inscriptions. There are quite a few in Scotland, but also in parts of northern England. I know that I remember reading last year someone discovered an Ogham inscription somewhere. So there are you can find them scattered around the place, scattered around Scotland, Northern England, and Wales. I don't know what the most southern in English Ogham inscription is. Um, it would be interesting to find out. The It's probably online somewhere because I think every Ogham inscription that they find is put online. There are various Ogham projects which are very important, and you can find online 3D models of most Ogham stones. I think the one in the field below me is there is an inscription of it. Now, if anyone else has a question, please feel free to shout. Now, you're very welcome, Wayne. I wanted to raise something. I did a video which some of you have seen about the famine, and I did a short on TikTok. And basically, I'm trying to say, look, history is complicated. Don't believe all these myths. But I just find it strange or interesting why people cling to myths so much. You can present them with evidence. In Ireland, a lot of that has got to do with anti-British things, anti-English things more likely. Like people love to say, "Oh, the famine, blame the famine on the English. It was all the English. The English did all this badly." And you can say, well, it's a bit more complicated than that. You're not exempting the English government from blame, because I get a bit annoyed when people say it was the English. It wasn't the English. It was the English government. Most English people were poor and basically ordinary people trying to survive. They weren't the ones. They weren't Lord such and such. They weren't. They didn't have the power to affect Ireland. But people cling to these conceptions, and no matter how much evidence you can show them that things are more complicated, they really, really cling to it. And it can be other things like some people insist that Irish Bronze Age stuff came from Egypt, and there was trade between Egypt and Bronze Age Ireland, which is, if you actually look at a map, you're going to say how the Egyptian ships were built for sailing in the Mediterranean, sailing close to shore. Other ships from other countries would come to them. There's no way an Egyptian guy is going to sail along all of the Mediterranean, then into the Bay of Biscay, and then come up to Ireland to get some copper. But people insist on that. They really, really cling. And once you get into mythology, into stories like Queen Scotia, the amount of people who really, really insist on that, and then as well as there's a lot of mad stories. If you mention Queen Scotia, people will start telling you that the prophet. And someone lectured me once about the prophet Jeremiah, who is supposedly buried in Loch Crew, which is in Meath, and there's a very interesting stone carvings there. But they say that was done by Jeremiah, and this is not even mentioned in the Bible. There's no mention of Ireland in the Bible, but people cling to this. So it's something that's puzzling me. Now, I have a list of questions here. So if anyone else wants to shout away. Just returning to old Irish history, the question of Celts um, is. Thank you. Don't know able here to be relieved of any myths I've picked up along the way, and great to hear that. And great to hear that. Um, yeah, Paul, you're right. It's too easy to blame someone else when you say it's nearly always more nuanced. You learn stuff in school, and then other people do research and they say, "Oh, it's not too easy. It's not exactly like that." I know that, for example, helping my daughter. I'm not good for helping my daughter with history because I read her book and I say, well, the book's a bit wrong in this sort of way. And this could be about Irish history, it could be about Roman history, it could be about World War One, World War Two. History evolves all the time. History evolves all the time. Like one myth, Irish myth that's very, very common, uh, is that De Valera in 1945 went to the German embassy and signed a book of condolences on the death of Adolf Hitler. He didn't. And I hate to be defending De Valera because I'm not a fan of his whatsoever. He actually went to the house of the German ambassador. He wasn't called an ambassador, I think minister they called him. And he went there to tell this German ambassador that if he wanted to stay in Ireland, Ireland would give him refuge. He went there in part because he had a good personal relationship with this guy, strongly in contrast to his relationship with the American ambassador. The American ambassador in Ireland during the Second World War was very complicated. He didn't seem to like the Irish at all, and he didn't like the Irish government. Nowadays, when you talk about Irish influence in Washington, okay, not under Trump, but under previous ones, Kennedy, Reagan, everybody on St. Patrick's Day, there's always either the Irish Taoiseach or someone important in Washington that day. But in the Second World War, relations were not good at all between the Irish government and the American ambassador. And I think the American ambassador hated De Valera in particular. So De Valera goes to the German ambassador's house, and he goes there to offer his like to say, look, if you want to stay in Ireland, you can. He probably did say something about the death of Hitler, but this gets rapidly transformed into De Valera going to the German embassy. And like now that like I'm fairly sure I was taught in school that De Valera did go to the embassy, whereas historians who work with this, they go crazy. Like if they're ever online, they say no, this is all wrong. I've written about this. I've said this. It's a myth that won't die. Trump had Conor McGregor at the White House. Okay, I wish he'd keep him. I'm not a McGregor fan. So like this was a myth that sprung up very, very, very quickly. Myths seem to appear all the time. Some of them work their way into history. And like that thing of De Valera, it happened in 1945, which is say 80 years ago. It's not that long ago, but it's something that didn't happen, but people say it's happened. And I know like First World War historians, there's this myth in English history that was created in the war period, this idea rather than myth of lions led by donkeys, which basically said all the English generals were stupid and they stayed at home, and they stayed like way back. It was the common soldiers who got killed, whereas there's a lot of research going on that says no, that didn't happen. A large amount of generals did get killed, and there were a lot of changes. I think both are actually correct, but it just goes to show you can You can argue about, oh, I'm just getting served food here. I'll eat later. I just got served food. Um, you can argue about anything in history. There's always different perspectives. There's always different perspectives. Um, I like to read different perspectives, and I think everybody should. Like, thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Wayne. There's actually my son actually cooked, and I told him I wasn't going to have anything, but my daughter thinks I'm hungry or thinks I'm going to starve to death. But I'll just let it here. Um, now, so just thank you very much. Don't knowable. Um, thank you, Dennis. Yeah, they're trained reasonably well. They're trained reasonably well, except early in the morning when it's time for school. That's when it's hard. That's when it's hard. I'm getting side eyes here. So let's talk about the Celts. Was Irish Celtic? Um, it seems an easy question to answer, but I think it's important to look at the term. The word Celtic was comes from the Greek Keltoi, and it basically meant barbarians or people who spoke funny, something like that. And it wasn't a term that was particularly common, but the Romans would they used the word Gauls, essentially for um, France, parts of Iberia, the north of Italy, Switzerland, parts of Germany, a big chunk of Western and Central Europe. They were all Gauls. Then you had Britons. The Irish were the Hibernians. So they didn't have this idea of Celts, especially Celts on the island. They had the Gauls was the big one. Where okay, there were some Celts like they knew the Italian were Celts, the Celts who captured Rome at some stage. Um, but the Irish were never Celts. And then the word Celts gets forgotten about, and it's only really rediscovered in the 16th century, especially the 17th century. Antiquarians start bringing up the idea of Celtic, and they initially specifically say the Irish were not Celtic. Oh no, the Irish are barbarians. They're not these big, tall, brave warriors who are Celtic. A lot of French historians are into the idea of Celts because in the 19th century, the French rediscovered Vercingetorix, if not slightly, probably slightly earlier. And Vercingetorix becomes a very important historian, a very important hero, the first French hero, if you like, because he defeated Caesar, even though Caesar beats him in the end. Um, and I'm fairly sure there's a couple of big statues of Vercingetorix in France. And if, like me, you grew up with Asterix, you know a bit about Vercingetorix, etc. So the Irish are looked down on by many English, but also many people in Europe, and they're not really regarded as Celts. Then you have the rise of Romanticism at the end of the 18th century, and there is a very surprising hit. There's a Scots guy, Macpherson, who basically steals the stories of Oisin, writes the name in a funny way. I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's Ossianan or something. It's Ossian. And he says he found all these poems, even though I think he wrote most of the poems himself. And it's a massive international bestseller. Napoleon loved it, various other people loved it. And this recreates an idea of Celtic, but Oisin that was regarded as Scottish, even though the stories came from Ireland. And if you look at the oldest versions of the stories that are about Ireland, there's much less of them about Scotland. Um, it's a it's a it's a It's a very funny fraud, if you like. And eventually, Macpherson gets caught out and admits that he wrote down everything. He's kind of forgotten about nowadays. I think if you studied literature or if you studied 18th century history, you will study about him, but like nobody knows. It's a bit like, say, 20 years ago, what's his name? Dan Brown. His book, The Da Vinci Code, was everywhere. You couldn't go anywhere without someone reading it. But whereas now it's starting to get forgotten. Macpherson's work had a bigger influence over a longer period, but then, boom, he's gone. He's not, most people will never hear about him. And this filters into Ireland. In the early 19th century, Gaelic history there's a bit is being rediscovered under the impact of Romanticism, under the impact of the emerging nationalism. It was believed that every nation had to have its own state, and then its own the language, the culture was also important, and so was its history. So people began to get interested in um, in these old texts, etc. So there's a big boom in the translation, say of the Annals of the Four Masters, Annals of Ulster. Um, During the 19th century, most of the translations of this stuff is in the 19th century, and especially of the Irish mythology. And then, because if you go on to any site and they're talking about Irish myths, most of the time they're using a translation of a translation of a translation, which goes back to 19th century translations of the original stories, which are problematic because they're translated from a Victorian mindset, which is very Puritan in many ways. So I think they censored a lot. Any mentions of sex or stuff like that were cut out. And they, any stuff that could point towards like a cultural identity, political ideas would have not been understood. So the translations are dodgy. But although it starts in an intellectual spirit, this idea of Celtic starts rolling. So at the end of the century, after the famine and after the Irish language gets this shock that dramatically undermines the language, about 30 years later, the Irish language seems to be rapidly disappearing, people start saying, hold on a second, what's going on? And they try to recover it. So you have this Gaelic Renaissance, and then like you have like Yeats, not Yeats, Yeats, Lady Gregory, Oscar Wilde's mother, and others. They start producing. First of all, you have folklore books, and then like Yeats's plays, like, and Lady Gregory's, and all their plays. So you have the idea of a Gaelic/Celtic Ireland is reinvented, and the Irish become Celts, and essentially they stay Celts till the 1980s. I started in UCD in 1985. In 1985, the Department of Archaeology was called the Department of Celtic Archaeology. I don't know when they dropped the Celtic, but it's well dropped. Now it's just archaeology. Since the 1990s, especially, people are kind of going, hold on a second, what does Celtic mean? Because there's huge differences. And with DNA, etc., the story is getting retold. The Gaelic Irish never saw themselves as Celtic. You can say, yes, they had a Celtic culture in that the language the language are like Irish and Manx and Scots Irish are one branch of this family, and Wales, Brittany, Cornish are another branch of it. It's called Celtic, but again, that's a label that was stuck on to cover it. No one would have regarded themselves as Celtic. Um, and there's a lot of interesting stuff being produced on it. There's an interesting archaeologist, Barry Cunliffe. He writes a lot of stuff. And a few years ago, he had the idea of Celts from the West, which in a way follows the Gaelic mythology of you know um, having arrived in Ireland via Spain, uh, and that created there was a lot of debate about that, but that seems to have been to be dropped at the moment. Like it's looking less and less that was true, though it could be that the language the there were trading networks. He was writing that there was a lot more contact between Ireland, Spain, and Portugal than people would think. There were a lot. Um, so if you go into an academic thing with this idea of Celtic, it's people will question it. But many people, like popular history, still loves the idea of Celtic. If you go into a music store, you can buy stuff Celtic music, whatever that means. Dennis, you're asking about response videos to some of the pseudo history. I've done a couple. Some do well, some don't. Uh, if you want to get YouTube views, it's very easy. You get loads of YouTube views doing bad history. Many years ago, when I first started, I did a video on Elizabeth Fort in Cork, and then someone, a family friend, was insisting that star forts there's something magical about them, and she sent me this video of this lady in the United States who homeschools her children, a mad evangelical, and she basically is going on Google Earth, and she would go to a star fort the British built in India, and she says, "Oh, no one could have built this at the time. It must have been aliens." So she didn't say aliens, but said, that was the idea. There was something. The in the 18th century, nobody could have built that when you can actually go and there's drawings of people building them. Especially in the French in the 18th century, they built star forts all over the place. And this video, I think, had like 50 or 60,000 views, and all zillions of comments, and they're all positive. So I like doing what I do on YouTube, but it can drive you crazy at times. It can drive you crazy. Don't know, but thank you very much for the comment. Thank you very much for the comment. Yeah, not ancient. I'm not sure she said ancient angels because she was an evangelical, so I don't think evangelicals like ancient aliens. Maybe it was ancient angels. I don't follow those details too much. Don't know about you asked another question. Is this the same wave of re-identification where the idea of the Celtic nations came from? Yeah, in a way, sort of over time. Like the Irish, I think. First of all, the Welsh discovered the idea of Celtic in a way first. There was a guy, I can't remember his name. He was essentially a nobody, but he reinvented the Druid order, and the Druid order still exists in Wales and England now. And he invented this, and he wrote loads of stuff which he said was old. And he's an interesting guy in that he knew his history. He could speak Welsh, but he just invented loads and loads and loads. Creates a Druid order, and they all go around dressed in white. If you ever go to Google, type Stonehenge Druids, you'll see these guys there. It's completely bad history, but it started something rolling in Wales that is still going on. The Irish pop into this a bit later, and then they get much stronger than Wales. I haven't been to Wales in a long time. So I don't know how strong the idea of Celtic is there. I know among some nationalists it's very strong, but generally no. Whereas Irish people regard themselves as Celtic. But if you go, say, to parts, say, Galicia in Spain or parts of Portugal, um, they are very attached to the idea of Celto-Iberian. So they like the idea of Celtic. In Britain, it's the same thing. So in a way, in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Celtic has come to mean something that is non-English. Um, so it's the you often see the Celtic fringe or whatever, but it is the non-English parts of Britain and Ireland. There, that was Celtic kind of means. There is a shared history with Scotland and Wales to an extent. There is a shared language roots. Celtic is an easy label, but applying the Celtic nations is completely different to the Roman or Greek idea of Celtic. So it's a funny thing. But then lots of German academics are really, really strong about the idea of Celtic, and they don't understand why Irish academics are starting to move beyond it. Because I prefer the word Gaelic because it's what they saw themselves as. So the Celtic is a label put on them much later. It's not something that was important to them. Yes, there may be some sort of shared roots, but um, it's the same. Like if you're a Belgian historian, you can't label, if you just say, "Oh, the Belgians are really French." That's really bad history because there's lots of things there. Alex, you're asking about Graham Hancock and his theory related to ancient civilization wiped by a great cataclysm. Um, and then you put a winking face. So I think your answer is probably the same as mine, that I don't think of it. um, I I've never read. I've seen him speak. Like I've seen some of his stuff on YouTube, and I think it's pseudo history, pseudo archaeology, where you're stretching what's there to suit your purpose. You have an answer, and you go and look for evidence that conforms with the answer. Um, and there's no ancient aliens. There's no ancient civilization. There were ancient civilizations, but not the big one that was everywhere. Not Atlantis, that Graham Hancock wrote about. I actually like to listen to podcasts where they discuss the history of Graham Hancock's. Sort of, you go back to the 19th century, if not before. There are people who are arguing this, and I just find a lot of their ideas really funny. Graham Hancock was lucky in that I think he got a Netflix program, um, which seems to have done well. And I know in the States there's some sort of TV show called Ancient Aliens, because I listen to podcasts and historians, American historians, um, and or archaeologists. They kind of talk about this program, and they they almost curse at it or cry. So I've never seen it, but to me it's some strange myth far away. This program called Ancient Aliens. Yeah, Tantaria is another one that's appearing. Supposedly, where Russia was and other places was this great big other civilization. Um, I always my problem with this is humans talk, humans make mistakes, humans look at any war, and you'll always find someone going out into the middle of battle with all the plans and getting killed or dropping the suitcase in the wrong place, and the enemy getting presented with the plans. That happens all the time. Um, there's always evidence, but um, humans are not good at keeping secrets. Sort of, all these conspiracies about the governments, if they were true, someone somewhere would have made a mistake and, like, lost the laptop or sort of lost the printout, and it would have been found. There's no evidence for this sort of stuff. It's just I don't know why people keep inventing and reinventing that stuff. Sometimes it's easier than trying to. It's easier to talk about Atlantis, to talk about a cataclysm, a lost civilization, than it is to talk about. Well, we found in this place this type of pottery. There's another type of pottery there. Because I like archaeology. I prefer history, but my problem with archaeology is that it's very, very dry to read quite often. Like so, and it portrays itself as a science much more than history does. And the idea that they kind of write down everything where they found everything. So you will um you read about a dig, and like you'll go through pages and pages where they're showing little pictures or they're discussing lots and lots of stuff that is not very interesting. And then 20 pages on, 30 pages on, they actually get into more interesting stuff, and that is good to read. Whereas if you're producing sort of a Hancockian thing, you can skip all the boring parts and just produce something more exciting. So I think people may find it easier to read. Um, Garlic, was there Scottish settlement of Munster? Not directly. There would have been some Gallowglass. I think the McSheehys especially would have come down here. The McSheehys served the Desmonds, and O'Connor Carey and Fitzmaurice in the early modern period. So O'Connor Carey, um, his place was northeast Kerry. So he had this castle on the Shannon, and below him was the Fitzmaurice lordship. They had very good relationships with the O'Malley's, and the O'Malley, so stuff they would import, say soldiers or gunpowder or other stuff. It would go from Scotland to Mayo, and then from Mayo down the coast into the Shannon Estuary, and then into Kerry. So there was some sort of Scottish settlement, but in small numbers would have come that way. The big settlement of Munster was the plantation, which in the 1580s. But at that stage, Scotland was still a separate kingdom. That in and the Munster plantation collapsed in 1598. Afterwards, under James and then especially under Cromwell, a lot more English soldiers, some would have been Scottish, would have come in and be given or bought land. So they would have come in slowly. The big Scottish settlement would have been the plantation of Ulster, in part because it's so much nearer. If you're a settler leaving your home, the shorter you can go, the better. So to go from Scotland to the northeast of Ulster is very quick, whereas to come all the way down through the Irish Sea, which was always dangerous, and then to Munster was more complicated. Would have been a more dangerous journey, so there was much less of it. Um, Probably certain Scottish people would have ended up here, but there wasn't that connection. Like there was until 50 years ago, there were a lot of movements of peoples between Donegal and Scotland. There were people from poorer parts of Donegal who would go to Scotland to work, sometimes even seasonally, because you could get there in a matter of, let's say a day. It was relatively quick to move over. Whereas Munster is the furthest bit away. Um, Okay, unless to err is human, cat. Yeah, definitely, definitely. So I'm going to wrap things up there. I hope you enjoyed it all. I will be back next week. I'm going to try. It'll probably be Thursday again because my wife is away and my daughter has soccer training on Tuesday night. So unless I can get someone else to bring her, I will come on Thursday. I hope you enjoyed it. So um, I'll see you soon. Boa noite, Cat. Didn't know you could speak Portuguese. Uh, don't notable. Thanks so much. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's always good to hear that people enjoy it. And if you haven't subscribed, you can subscribe to the channel, watch the videos, leave comments. It all helps. It all helps. And feel free to submit questions for the next one. Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Kira. I'll see you all soon. So and as well as questions, if you have ideas for new videos, Dennis gave me an idea there, which I'm going to think about pseudo histories. So yeah. So I'll say good night, Slán, Ihawa, and I'll see you next week. Bye bye.